Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's conversation, which I think is happening while a lot of things are in flux in terms of what it has happened and what is happening in Afghanistan. I think the last 7 to 10 days have really been a whirlwind for many of us who have followed this long war over the last 20 years. And some of us, including myself, have had to eat dirt in the last week or so, in the sense that we expected that the regime in Kabul would stand for a lot longer than what it eventually did, and that the disgraceful exit of the president of Afghanistan into the UAE now would not occur until maybe a few months down the road. But things are the way they are, and Taliban are in Kabul. There are some resistant forces in Panjshir that are continuing to fight, but a lot remains to be seen, and a lot will be determined by the way things go forward in terms of an Afghan dialogue. But the impact on Pakistan is visible. And we're going to be talking about what it means, everything means for Pakistan, its economy, its investment climate, its security climate. What does ascendant Taliban mean for women in Pakistan is a big topic as well. But before we jump in, one thing I'd like to also say at the outset is that we often, as Pakistanis, are critical, and in many ways critical, rightfully so, of the positions our government takes or the state takes or the way the PIA or the bureaucrats or the civil society operates. But the last few days have shown how hardworking and how amazing stuff can happen when people take leadership positions, in the sense that the embassy in Kabul, the Pakistani embassy in Kabul, has done a phenomenal job helping out people who need to get out of Afghanistan, processing visas, working day and night to support those who need support. And then the PIA flying those planes out of Kabul that day when there was no air traffic control, and getting people to safety, and showcasing a lot of bravery from the crew members to get people away and towards safety in Pakistan. I think those are things that we should commend and applaud and support, because these are heroes who are doing a lot of really important work in a very dicey situation on the ground in Afghanistan. So I just wanted to put that out there, because it is also important that while we criticize and critique, that we applaud and support our civil servants when they do amazing stuff as well. That being said, today's talk, I'm going to stop speaking very quickly. We have Dr. Fahd Ali, Dr. Afiya Shehrbano, and Hasaan Khawar here joining us today to talk about and share their views and insights about what they think the ascendancy of the Taliban and the situation in Afghanistan means for Pakistan. Dr. Fahd Ali has a Ph.D. in economics from the New School for Social Research. He has a deep focus on macroeconomics, on the region. And so it would be great to hear his thoughts about what all of this means, particularly from an economic perspective on Pakistan. Dr. Afiya Shehrbano is a feminist researcher. She's author of the book Faith and Feminism in Pakistan. And so it would be great to hear her thoughts about everything that has happened, and in particular, get some of her thoughts on what all of this means for women's right, not just in Pakistan, but the broader region, and what an ascendant Taliban means from her point of view. And then Hasaan Khawar is a management and international development consultant, writes a lot, very insightful commentary on what goes on in Pakistan, and would love to hear Hassaan's thoughts in particular on what's going on the ground and what are people thinking and saying in Pakistan about everything that has happened, because a lot of times the commentary, at least on social media, is skewed one way or the other. Either it's all about people celebrating that the Taliban have arrived, or others saying that this is the end of the world. So maybe Hasaan can help us have a more nuanced discussion on what people are saying on the ground. With that, the way we're going to do this conversation is have Dr. Fahd Ali share some of his thoughts at the outset, then Dr. Afiya, and then Hasaan. And then I'll ask a couple of questions just to start the discussion, and then we'll keep it open to the audience in case people have questions. Feel free to put it in the chat box. And so with that, Dr. Fahd Ali, would love to hear your thoughts on everything that has happened, and what do you think all of this means for Pakistan?
I think if I were to say that, this is a very, very complex situation, that would probably be the most obvious understatement of the year so far. It's I think how quickly the situation has escalated is not something that anybody was anticipating. People thought that, of course, people were expecting since last year when the Trump administration entered into talks with the Taliban, about an exit plan, about an exit strategy, that sort of, the American exit from Afghanistan was certainly on the cards, and it was going to happen sooner than later. And what I think also many of us perhaps expected that, once the Americans leave, Taliban is going to make sort of, a lot of gains in terms of territory. But nobody really anticipated that they would actually be able to take over Afghanistan in a matter of 10 days. And nobody really expected that once America announces its exit plan and exit strategy, it would actually, botch the job the way that it actually did. So I think, but I think sort of, in all of this, Pakistan has actually been, the Pakistani state has actually been very closely involved in the whole process. I mean, we have known it for a very long time that sort of, the American government have wanted Pakistan to play its role in bringing the Taliban on the negotiating table, so that they could the Americans could negotiate some kind of a ceasefire, some kind of a cessation of hostilities, and while they sort of devise an exit strategy. And it's not that sort of Pakistan has faced, I think, has faced some pressure from the US. It has also been sort of under some pressure from Taliban itself, like sort of so yes, we come to the negotiating table, then what in return, what can you promise us in return? What will happen to us once the Americans leave? Would we be allowed to govern the way we would want to, etc. So Pakistan has actually has played, I think, is playing into a very, very tricky situation where it won't just be enough for it to satisfy just one side. It now has to satisfy multiple actors in the region. I mean, so we have been, I think we have been instrumental in holding a meeting between the Taliban and the Chinese government as well. So to the extent that after that meeting, Chinese government has also showed an interest in or showed its willingness to recognize a future future government led by Taliban. I mean, I use the word led very, very consciously. I think Russia has actually made similar overtures, so Pakistan probably has something to do, something to do with that in the background as well. So I think this is actually a very, very tricky situation for Pakistan. That if it is unable to satisfy so many sides, it would actually bear the brunt of not just like one international one superpower or one economic or military power, that is the US, but then it would now have to sort of bear the brunt of very unhappy countries in its immediate neighborhood, particularly China and Russia. And sort of Chinese are already at our case because in the recent developments in the past 2 months or so, where we have seen a number of Chinese engineers dying in terrorist attack. There was one just yesterday, that I think yesterday or day before yesterday, that killed a Chinese engineer and injured 2 kids in or near Gwadar. So, and China has again sort of stressed that Pakistan should act on the perpetrators. Must take practical steps on all of this. I think so. I see the larger situation actually developing in this particular context. I think this is this Pakistan is gambling. I hope that sort of Pakistan actually holds the right kind of cards as well, in which it can actually win the hand, rather than sort of just try to bluff its way out of the situation. And sort of particularly, and one last point that I would want to make, obviously vis-a-vis Taliban, Pakistan has already started talking about sort of whether Taliban would be able to exert its influence on the TTP, and whether they would actually be able to. I think one thing that we do not say openly is whether Taliban is also going to assert some influence on on the unrest in Balochistan, on sort of the other secessionist groups working in Balochistan that may have taken sanctuary in Afghanistan, whether they would actually act against them as well. So I think Pakistan has this. Some people I think are celebrating over here, and very foolishly so. But I think all of a sudden Pakistan has actually opened too many fronts, and it remains to be seen whether we can actually fight on so many fronts and handle so many fronts, with in the sense that it can actually benefit us or not.
Yeah, very important points, and I think the point around particularly not being able to satisfy all the sides. I would say, in particular, the Chinese, who have taken a pretty stronger public position around Pakistan needing to do more in terms of dealing with the threat at home. Also, want to just mention to the audience that um, over 60 security personnel have died in the last 2 months, Pakistani security personnel. So the terror threat has actually materially gone up. And the number of soldiers and security personnel that have been in harm's way has gone up. 60 plus have died. There was an IED blast just yesterday or day before yesterday as well. So it's a very tricky situation. I want to ask you a couple of questions, Dr. Fahd, but before I do that, yes.
Can I just quickly add something? Sorry, I just wanted to quickly. I think, one thing that also Pakistan needs to be wary of, it's possible, likely implication of our larger macro environment. I mean, Pakistan Eurobond, as you know, and sort of, I think we'll be able to talk about this more. What could be the possible implication of it? Pakistani Eurobond has already taken a beating in the international market. As prices fell once Kabul fell to Kabul. So I think it's sort of, it has larger implication about sort of, whether the international capital would want to move to Pakistan, whether sort of, the investment, whether the investment, foreign investment would actually come into Pakistan in things other than sort of, in stock market. And I think obviously all of this also puts a big question mark on the Chinese investment in the country as well. Yeah, absolutely. So I sorry for taking more time than I should have.
I think that's a very important point, and we'll get back to the macroeconomic implications just a bit. Dr. Afiya, over to you. In particular, like we've seen, reports coming out initially, this PR sort of effort being made by the Taliban that, everyone can go back to their jobs, amnesty for everybody. But there's a big asterisk there that everything has to happen in accordance with Sharia law. And we're already seeing that terms and conditions being tested, so to speak, in terms of can women come back to work in their government jobs, what happens to women in universities, etc. How do you see everything as a feminist researcher and as someone who's done a lot of research around the role of faith and the role of women in Pakistan? Like, what are the implications of the fact that the Taliban regime is now in power in Kabul?
Thank you, Jose. And I actually welcome this this series of talks because I think it's important that we speak now. And one of the first things that I find, actually quite comical is this global male leaders who are suddenly so invested and interested and worried about women's rights and women's issues in Afghanistan, whereas they have absolutely zero interest in gender issues in their own countries, right? And especially, old white men like Thomas Friedman and Tony Blair, etc., should be ashamed of themselves, in saying anything on this particular issue and being worried about it. So I think it would be, the issue of women's rights in Afghanistan and the concern of it would be comical if it wasn't so serious, right? The other important point before I go into that is, that, you mentioned at the beginning that Ashraf Ghani's sort of exit was disgraceful from Afghanistan. And I find it interesting because when we discuss Pakistan's General Musharraf, who was the frontline ally, who pulled us and dragged us into this war, and at a huge cost, not just economic, but definitely in terms of making Pakistan a graveyard of the Afghan and the fallout from over there, his exit is not characterized as such, So I think that's an important, if we're going to do a reckoning, it needs to be done on everybody's role in what has led us to this point. So yes, I think that, I'm very wary, as many were 20 years ago, about using the woman card, if you like, or using, the issue of feminism, making it a lever for intervention. I think if you're going to be outraged about the treatment, and which we are, and certainly women in Afghanistan do feel betrayed. If that is the wrong word, then certainly anxious, worried about what's going to happen because they have institutional memory and they have actual memories of what took place with their families and them during the Taliban governance. But if you are going to be worried and anxious about it, you have to earn that privilege. You have to earn the privilege of being outraged, which means improve your own record and show that you are committed committed to the idea of women's rights or minorities' rights or sexual minority rights, and lobby with your own leaders on your women's rights records. But at the same time, like you said, and Fahd said, there's no need for celebration on our side either. There's no need for a smugness from the patriots or even from the left, if that is trickling through. Because the fact is, rights are critically important. They are inherently important. They cannot be separated or suspended, that we'll take care of these after the occupation, or that war is more important, and conflict needs to be dealt with, or poverty is, the usual arguments that we went through in 2001. And I'd also never agreed, even Uzair at that time, about this idea of let's take a break from feminism, or Muslim women don't need to be rescued. I mean, yes, I don't weaponize it. I understand the metaphors. But what did it mean strategically or practically? I think so. There is some reflection that is required on our part as well. You cannot privilege domestic patriarchy, or privilege imperial patriarchy over domestic patriarchy. The two work together, the two collude. So which brings one to this, the other question that you asked, that, if you don't want others or non-Afghan sort of actors or stakeholders speaking about these issues of rights, then what's stopping other countries, Muslim majority countries, or Muslim leadership from issuing their concerns and warnings? Why are you then waiting for the West to either talk or to insist that they be silent about it? Daily we have moralizing, we have entire fatwa factories in our countries. So why can't we have the same rage machine, in full force on women's rights? If you don't want Western human rights standards, or you don't want their leadership discussing it, then why aren't you talking about it and discussing it? And that then raises this question, quite genuine question: what kind of rights are we discussing? What kind of rights are considered appropriate for Afghanistan? And here there's a slight complication, an interesting complication, that, Afghanistan has ratified more United Nations treaties on rights, including CEDAW, which the United States has not. So that throws in an interesting challenge. Can somebody who hasn't committed themselves to certain international treaties and standards then moralize to other countries? On the other hand, there is a certain responsibility on those who want to see genuine and have, a sort of a sisterly relationship with feminists in Afghanistan. And there, the danger about something called Sharia rights is problematic. I mean, yesterday I spoke with somebody who was a member of RAWA, the Revolutionary Association, Afghan Women's Association. And they're already falling into this dilemma of, should we negotiate with the Taliban now? These are the pragmatic, real issues. We can say, let's not rescue them. But surely we have to give some kind of solidarity, support, guidance, and sort of, moral assistance as well. Should they negotiate on something called Sharia rights? And here I have, serious reservations about it. And it's not about, some Western Enlightenment inspired, secular inspired feminism or white feminism. The fact is that we always tend to prescribe Sharia rights, which are appropriate for the unwashed masses, for the poor Afghans, for the poor Muslims, while we elite Muslims should be able to access secular rights, freedoms, universal human rights, sexual rights, mobility, etc. So what's this nonsensical split that, Sharia rights are appropriate for poor Muslims or conflict-ridden Muslims, and elite Muslims should have access to all kinds of secular, Western, international human rights standards? So, I just want to sort of flag these issues rather than repeating them as we did last time. And I will come back to this point about that Fahd made about, again, in terms of the macro and the impact on Pakistan. I'm not so worried, which is a genuine worry, that, there's going to be sort of a endorsement or giving some support to Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. I'm more worried about how this is going to embolden Jamaat-e-Islami, the irrelevant, redundant Jamaat-e-Islami who is celebrating, and the women of Jamia Hafsa and the Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan. We have new actors in the game as well. And so we need to be wary about the kind of wind that this is going to give to conservatism and a kind of the Islamist politics that has and the pious politics that has grown in Pakistan in the last 20 years. We are not where we were in 2001 either.
I think you raised some very important points, in particular the last one, which I want to come back to, which is this resurgence of Islamist thought, right? Like if you have a Islamist ideology winning across the border after a 20 years long militant struggle, then what does that mean for others within the Pakistani borders, whether they want to play with or without the rules of the game, so to speak, in terms of the setup Pakistan has? And what does that do in terms of creating tailwinds for them and saying, look, if the Afghan Taliban can do something similar, then why not the TLP, or why not just Jamaat Islami, which is actually, today there was a billboard put up in Peshawar, or yesterday, congratulating them, and the Jamiyat Ulama Islam Fazlur Rahman wrote a letter congratulating the Afghan Taliban as well. So there is a big political impact in terms of everything that happens in Kabul as well. Hasaan, I want to come to you and get your thoughts on how do you see things shaping up within Pakistan? We've sort of seen, particularly on social media, but also like in terms of the comments made by the Prime Minister, for example, who said that Afghans have broken the shackles of slavery after Kabul was taken over by the Taliban. So what's the mood like from your point of view within Pakistan, and how are people reacting to, and how should the people in positions of leadership react to and talk about everything that has happened in Afghanistan?
Thank you, Uzair. Very interesting discussion going on in a topic. I think it's very interesting. I think your first question is, how is the mood in Pakistan? I would say it's like chalk and cheese, right? Poles apart. It's a highly polarized opinion, and I'll come to that. I think what's going on across our western border is a wild card, and I'll also get to that. And I think what lies for Pakistan is probably something like trick or treat. And I'll get to this part. But let's first talk about chalk and cheese, right? So in Pakistan, I have seen moods of desperation, frustration, prophecies coming true. I've also seen celebration, people sending felicitations to each other. Some people who identify themselves as Islamic ideologists, they think that it's their victory. People who are on the extreme left end, they think it's their defeat. So I see all sorts of things. And I think there are very clearly two camps. You have talked about that billboard. I saw the picture you shared on the group. So that's very clear. But there is also a very big faction on social media who think that Taliban, of course, judging them by their 20-year-old history, they think it's going to be a big problem. But I think it's very fascinating to see how these two opinions, which are poles apart, can coexist in a country, and both sides are there. Now, coming to the wild card bit, I think, and you rightly said that many people thought that the Afghan government would hold on for long. Interestingly, I did not see any solid prediction about the direction of what happened. People did differ on the pace, on the speed of events, but everyone thought that Taliban are going to come over, especially judging them by the recent events, even before they took over Kabul. Now, there are all sorts of discussions. Right? What are the options for the West? What are the options for Pakistan? I think the most pragmatic question is how Taliban are going to react, and no one knows. But we can judge them rationally. Whether they'll be rational or not, I don't know. But there's a very big camp who think that they now are in search of legitimacy. They have lost 20 years. Yes, they are back with full force, but they do not want to kind of get into a similar situation again. That's why they are supposed to have a better track record of human rights, women's rights. Probably they will have more representation in the government in whatever form that government would be. But I think these are just some optimistic forecasts. We don't know, right? So, of course, they come in from a very strong ideological mindset that, of course, will have bearings. But I think the way they are going to decide is going to have a very big bearing on the repercussions for Pakistan and for the other stakeholders. Then comes the third bit, what lies for Pakistan, where I said trick or treat. What I meant was that there are a lot of opportunities for Pakistan. And of course, there are a lot of threats. By opportunities, I mean that, of course, if you have Taliban government there, A government in Afghanistan could have had many permutations, but that's a permutation that, of course, Pakistan has a greater voice in and a greater role in. So I think that's one. The second is that if there is a stable government in Afghanistan, if it's a big if, then we can have hopes for peace, stability, and of course, more communication, connectivity, and all of that. Pakistan also has a lot of say, so a lot of business opportunities, trade opportunities, and other things are there. So that's the big the treat part. But of course, there are a lot of question marks there. The first is the ideological spillover. If you are having an Islamic state right across the border, then how is it going to fare for similar ideologies in this part of the country? Then I think one of the fellow panelists shared the view about TTP. I think the biggest question from a security standpoint is that what's going to be Taliban's relationship with TTP and the likes of TTP in Pakistan. I think that's another big threat that we face. The third is that while we leave it open for speculation that how much say Pakistan has in Afghanistan's affair, and people have different opinions, right? Everyone agrees that Pakistan has a lot of say. Some say that Pakistan could really dictate terms. Others say, well, it's tricky. The world believes that Pakistan has a big say in affairs of Afghanistan. And if something goes wrong, whether rightly or wrongly, Pakistan will have to take responsibility for that. So I think it's a mixed bag of opportunities and threats for Pakistan. And right now, as I said earlier, that we can speculate, we can forecast, we can apply a rational state of mind to predict how things are going to pan out, or we can judge them by history. That's another frame to look at things. And as you move on from one frame to another, you see very different outcomes coming out of the situation. But that's how I look at it for now.
Thanks, Hassan, and some very interesting points. And the ideological spillover one, I think, is a common theme that between you, Dr. Afiya, and Dr. Fahd has come up. Dr. Afiya, I want to ask you this question, particularly as it relates to the role of women and the space that women have in the Pakistani public space, which is not huge, but it is still something. The Chief of Army Staff, General Bajwa, recently said in a speech that he and Pakistan expects that the Taliban will honor their commitments towards women's rights and minority rights, and that's something that he himself is keeping an eye out on. From your point of view, do you see, what risks do you see, I would phrase it better, what risks do you see in terms of an ideological spillover to the role and options and the lives of women in Pakistan from this resurgent Taliban? And number two, what are some of the things that you would like Pakistani leaders and the Pakistani government to do in terms of standing in solidarity with not only women in Afghanistan, but also minorities over there, and also because it has an impact in terms of what goes on at home?
So if the Chief Qamar Bajwa has said so, then surely it will happen. I mean, there's no problem. Imagine that the Prime Minister of the country doesn't say so, but the Chief of Army Staff says so. So, I mean, who knows? If he says so, it may just happen. But, I'm flippant about that. But I think that this is an important question which links to somebody's question in the chat also. There's this myth that, there is no affinity. I mean, this is a dangerous kind of slippery slope, that there's no affinity between, and I remember the Western sort of powers did this at that time also. Oh, these are Deobandis, and they categorized, beautifully on a blackboard. These are Deobandis and these are Barelvis. And surely we've learned that lesson, that kind of exercise had zero meaning on the ground. So, I mean, my suggestion is not to fall into this trap of saying, the Tehreek-e-Taliban has nothing to do with TLP, that has nothing to do with the MMA. If you study what the MMA did in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa under General Musharraf's period, they were the Politburo. The TTP was sort of stage managed by the MMA. The MMA, which included Jamaat-e-Islami, Jamiyat Ulema-Islam, and 4 other parties, they were the chief architects for creating an enabling environment in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. They destroyed the social and political fabric of Pakhtunkhwa, apart from the fact that hundreds of thousands of lives were lost of politicians. So, I mean, I think this romance about, there is some extreme differences and there's something called radical and that has nothing to do with the moderate, is to fall into the Musharrafian trap. So surely we should learn from that. That's one thing. The other point about what should we then be looking at, what is the advice for, or what do we hope that leadership should be looking for certainly not compromising on women's issues. In Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, we had an opportunity in 2017 to look at the merger of the former FATA and the new districts, the newly merged districts, and what interest has civil society or anybody else taken in those. We had an opportunity to fix land reforms for women, to ensure that property was in the name of women. We had an opportunity to sort of correct all the mistakes we made in the judicial system and to improve laws, etc. And we didn't deliver on that. So, one has to be wary and mindful of that, the Hisbah bill kind of initiatives. These are early warning symptoms. And if we are not alert to these early warning symptoms, we will fall down the same chute. So one of the biggest recommendations, if you're serious about it, and if you want to understand what's happening, and you can ask us certainly, but the organization and the movement that you should pay attention to then, instead of being suspicious about it, which includes state leadership, is the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement. They are an indigenous, long, sort of suffering and on the ground, authentic, indigenous spokespeople for the people. But them you want to erase completely or call them treacherous or dissenters. And this is my, discussion with Fahd also, long-term discussion, that we're extremely scathing about Western imperialism and white imperialism, but we never pay attention to our own racism, within Pakistan, and this constant portrayal of the Pashtuns as betrayers and treacherous and all the rest of it. So, get rid of those stereotypes that live. We can't constantly criticize others and reproduce them ourselves. And yes, what would we like? Sort of Pakistan leadership or those interested in addressing this issue is to scrutinize the kind of projects and programs that are going to be coming in. I can't predict what the economic situation can be, maybe the others can. But it's important to scrutinize, because this is a mistake that donors made, and this impatience that I can see in the chat also. Let's get to the economics. What can we throw at Pakistan? What can we throw at Afghanistan? What are the safety nets we put up? This is the kind of impatience that led to millions of dollars thrown to Pakistan by DFID, by USAID, that did things like funded studies like understanding Islam, understanding Sharia, understanding Muslims. Enough with the understanding and prescribing home-based work for women and culturally appropriate things and madrasa reforms. Surely we should have learned our lessons from that and realized that Pakistan has moved on, the world has moved on. Don't slot us back into that home-based kind of work, or texts and apps are appropriate for women because they can sit in their homes and silently create a revolution. That's just complete nonsense. Don't make that mistake, that really irritating mantra of Western leadership, that we're going to win the hearts and minds of Afghan. Please don't. You failed spectacularly and you just annoyed the heck out of everybody. You spoiled the projects for us as genuine resistance that we offered, and you complicated us. You complicated that kind of existing movement. So pay attention to what the movements are already on the ground, what they have been doing for the past 20 years. Pay attention and take your cues from them. And we can discuss some specifics. But for example, the Benazir Income Support Program has had a certain impact in Pakistan. I'm not suggesting you duplicate anything. I'm just saying, at least study that. What has been its results or successes? Maternal mortality has improved in Afghanistan. You have to acknowledge that and look at it empirically. Deaths in childbirth have declined, and school enrollment has increased. Civil services have taken more women, etc., etc. So again, I'm not saying romanticize that, but pay attention to that as a minimum standard. And the minute you see that starts slipping, it's an early warning symptom. It's an indicator that things are going south. It's no matter what kind of economic programs you throw to Afghanistan and Pakistan or support, if these are symptomatic of what's happening in the country, if you don't pay attention to them, you will go down exactly the same path as before.
Speaking of early warning indicators, Dr. Fahd, you mentioned this earlier as well, and I want to broaden this point out because this has come up in the chat as well, which is the Pakistani bonds sort of, had an impact. There was an impact on the bond market after Kabul was taken over. FATF obviously continues to be the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Pakistan is still on the gray list. The IMF program is still ongoing. And if I just sort of remind everyone of history, in the 80s when Pakistan and the ISI and everybody else helped the United States along with the CIA to beat back the Soviets in Afghanistan, that was a good time for the Pak-US relationship, but it was shortly followed by sanctions on Pakistan related to the nuclear program, but the relationship was in a much better place, and despite that, there were sanctions. Right now, you already are seeing almost daily articles in Western press, in particular American press, about how Pakistan played this double game, what WikiLeaks said in 2010, et cetera, et cetera. All of that has an impact in the sense that sort of defeated establishment in DC will look for scapegoats and will seek to punish those scapegoats. Pakistan would be, I would argue, number one on that list. How do you see all of that shaping up in terms of overall risk environment for investments in Pakistan and economic stability? I think you're on mute.
Yes, sorry, I was on mute. I often do this in webinars. No, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of interesting that, all the things that you have mentioned just right now, I had actually listed exactly these same things. I listed down FATF over here, exchange rate pressure, loan repayment requirements, IMF, program. I mean, I think, this is, I would actually begin with the last point that sort of, because Washington has so spectacularly failed in, particularly in coming up with a, with a suitable exit strategy and sort of, not botching it up. And plus the way Taliban has actually swiftly taken over Afghanistan has actually left them extremely embarrassed, and they would look for somebody to get punished for this, or maybe scapegoat obviously somebody for all of this. And Pakistan will certainly be on the top of the list. And I think many of our many members of our audience may not remember the 90s, but post first Afghan war, the 1990s was an extremely tough time for Pakistani economy. It wasn't an easy time for Pakistani economy, not just necessarily because Pakistan couldn't attract a lot of foreign investment because of the state economy, but it was economically unstable because it was politically unstable, and part of it, political instability, had to do with the way international community actually perceived that. So throughout the 90s, Pakistan actually battled with this idea whether Pakistan was actually a terrorist state or not, and sort of where sort of international community actually twice came very close to declaring Pakistan a terrorist state. So it was so we basically just moved from being almost being declared as a terrorist state to not being a terrorist state, and then sort of moving back to that point and coming out of it. Things only changed after 9/11. When in fact, had 9/11 not happened, we don't know what would have happened to Pakistan's economy, because by June, July 2001, Pakistani economy was in a very, very tricky spot. Its debt to GDP ratio had crossed 120%. Half of it was basically foreign debt, and it wasn't just like sort of the share of debt in the total GDP. It was basically about Pakistan's ability to service that debt, and Pakistan's ability to service that debt had become extremely compromised. Plus, Pakistan was actually going through a drought-like condition as well. We had not actually a drought in place, but we had drought-like conditions that actually impacted Pakistan's agriculture output. So we have we don't. I mean, of course, I'm not trying to do a one-on-one mapping over here, but I'm just trying to sort of trying to say all of this in order for us to recall the kind of difficulties that Pakistan actually can find itself in again. And this is not actually the same kind of economy that existed back in 1998. This is far more vulnerable to, let's say, external shocks than it was in 1998. This economy's private sector is far more exposed to the external sector, to sort of external lenders than it was, let's say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So, for example, in Pakistan's in past 10 years or so, Pakistan's private sector's exposure to international lenders has actually more than trebled. So 10 years ago, Pakistan only, $3 billion, Pakistani private sector had only taken $3 billion in loan. 10 years down the road, it has now taken almost $12 billion. So, if Pakistani economy, let's say, comes into into some kind of difficulty where private sector as well as the state sector finds it difficult to repay these debts because they can't sort of earn the foreign exchange, it can actually find itself into a very, very, very tricky spot. And I think, again, this political stability is going to be a key point. Afghanistan's own economy is actually in the coming weeks, it will actually become quite clear whether if Taliban can actually, or a government that they constitute over there, whether that's actually a broad-based government, whether that has any allies from opposition, will have an impact on all of that, because that is going to have an impact on their own economy. It is already facing food shortages. It has been completely cut off from access to its own funds. There is a lot of pressure on Afghani currency. So things, in Afghanistan, economically are going to deteriorate, and that will translate into a larger sort of, or a greater refugee pressure on Pakistan, where sort of, there would be a lot of migration from Afghanistan to Pakistan. And I think it's really unfortunate that Pakistan has actually, the official stance is that we will actually return those refugees rather than accommodating them over here. I think that's certainly something that Pakistan needs to reconsider. But all of that would actually, further put pressure on Pakistan's economy as well. And I think the key figure, I would just like one last thing that I would like to say that, again, sort of, a couple of last points actually. The key thing again is how it emboldens, how the Taliban regime in Afghanistan emboldens, as Dr. Afiya has actually so brilliantly pointed out, emboldens the local Islamists, and it emboldens particularly the TTP, and what kind of conflict does it actually enter into with the Pakistani state. So if that conflict actually becomes militant, as it did between 2007 and 2014, I think we know the ramifications of that in terms of the macroeconomic situation. I think the other thing is that if Taliban is unable to control let's say the EITC in it, it is unable to control the Daesh element within its border. It is unable to control Al Qaeda element in its borders. I think pressure will come to Pakistan again directly about sort of about the nature of our influence and relationship with the Taliban. And I think FATF is going to continue to stay hanging over us, which means that we will actually continue to be in the gray list. We will not perhaps move into the blacklist, but we'll continue to stay in the gray list, where sort of where the international community will use that to pressurize us to sort of do whatever they want Pakistani state to accomplish. And I think all of that would actually put a pressure, particularly on Pakistan's possible exchange rate, Pakistan's and Pakistan and sort of the international and the confidence that the investors have in Pakistan as a safe place to invest. So I think Pakistan's macroeconomic stability rating is also going to get a beating in coming months if the situation does not stabilize in Afghanistan. So I'll just again end over here.
I think what I'll also add to all of these valid points is that the instability in Afghanistan, along with the refugee flows, people need to remember that most of the wheat that goes into Afghanistan goes through Pakistan, and much of it is smuggled. If there is a prolonged crisis in Afghanistan, including refugee flows, that will put direct pressure on the wheat markets in Pakistan, leading potentially, again, food inflation going through the roof. And that is a separate local political economy risk that people have to keep in mind, that Pakistan is still, its food imports have grown by 80+% in the last year or so alone. And there is a potential scenario where these instability in Afghanistan and influx of refugees will affect the essential food markets in Pakistan pretty badly as well. The one thing I think, to your point, Dr. Saab, that you raised was that a lot has changed since the 90s, but the 90s were a very tough period, but a lot has also remained the same. So for example, and Hasaan, with that, I'll come to you. In the 90s, we remember, and I particularly remember, right after the war and the collapse of the Soviet Union, Pakistan had a position about leveraging Afghanistan for connectivity into Central Asia and beyond. Now it's called the geoeconomics pivot, but this was something that even Benazir Bhutto at the time, who was prime minister, had talked about in a couple of interviews. Of course, it did not come to fruition because of instability in Afghanistan, and since then that's been a pipe dream. Now you have China, which is Pakistan's biggest lender. Some 27-28% of Pakistan's bilateral debt is owed to China. Looking at BRI, I'm already seeing a lot of people in Pakistan sort of talking about mines and lithium and all of that stuff in Afghanistan that is ready for the tapping because it's worth over $1 trillion or so, and that the Chinese are going to help that achieve that dream. There's a couple of questions related to that in terms of China building trade infrastructure in Afghanistan as well to extend CPEC and BRI. How do you see the role of China in all of this, particularly from an economic perspective, where there may be alignments where Beijing may want to step in and say, you know what, there is money to be made here for everyone, and use that as an enticement to maybe come to some sort of peaceful transition in Afghanistan?
That's a very interesting angle. So US has kind of vacated this part of the world, right? So it has opened up. And China, of course, being a neutral player, I think has a much better uh, prospects to play a role here. They have the money. I think they have the right access. They are looked at in a very neutral fashion. They are also very close to Pakistan, and Pakistan has a lot of access there. So I think it all fares well for Chinese investment. I think the first question is I'll go back to that, how Taliban's are going to behave. Because if, for example, Taliban go back to the 90s mode, where international terrorist organizations are coming here and finding refuge, I think even for China, it's not going to be possible to support them all out, right? They cannot defend the whole world and marginalize everyone else and then just focus there. So I think the first and foremost question is that how internationally acceptable that government or that form of government in Afghanistan will be. So that's the first thing. Then I think I'm not sure about mining and like this gold rush in Afghanistan, but I do believe that there is money to be made because with Taliban's there, I personally believe that there is a greater chance of stability and peace compared to what we had before, where you have like a US sponsored government and then you have areas under Taliban control. So I think there's going to be more prospect of more chances of peace and stability. If there are, of course, there is money to be made. And if there's money to be made, then Pakistan will stand a chance. Chinese capital, Pakistani businessmen right across the border. So I think there are good economic opportunities for Pakistan. You talked about wheat. Yes, wheat is there, but I think many of our other exports also go to Afghanistan. So of course that opportunity is there as well. How well Pakistan can capitalize on that, it as I think all of us has talked about, it remains to be seen. Uh, and I think I agreed with Dr. Afiya, and I'd refer back to the comment in the chat box. Faisal Sherjan commented that there is actually zero ideological affinity between the Taliban and TDP, and I hope he's right, and I wish he's right. So I do agree with Faisal Saab that there are very big differences between who Taliban are and what TDP is, right? So their aims are different, their structures are different, they are different entities. Taliban are, of course, much more organized. TDP is like nothing more than scores of groups banded together. But I do think that ideological affinity is there in many ways in terms of the role of Sharia, the role of Islam, and other things. So I do see that link there. Although I wish that what he's saying is absolutely correct, and it goes the way he's predicting it to go. Again, I don't think if we are hoping, coming back to your question, like a very good, massive Chinese program coming into Afghanistan right away and Pakistan riding that wave, I think it's going to be a mixed bag. And I think the next few months are going to be very tumultuous. People are going to watch very carefully. And only then, I think we'd be able to say that whether there is going to be a big Chinese investment coming in there. And lastly, about your commentary and Pakistan's own economic issues, I do think, of course, a lot of things can go wrong, but Pakistan's internal issues, putting pressure on all these issues like IMF program, FATF, exchange rate, in my view, as of today, are much more grave than what's going on in Afghanistan. So I think if we put our house in order, and there are many ways we can do that. Probably, I think we'll sail through this, barring any untoward massive change in how we are expecting things to go. Thank you.
I think we have 10 minutes to go, so I'll let each one of you sort of share your concluding comments. But one thing that has been a common thread among all of your comments so far is that one, it is a very complicated situation, surprise, surprise. Two, a lot of things are still in flux. But three, I think this is the most important one that has come up is that in a way, the actor or the main actor in Kabul right now, Taliban, is also in search of legitimacy. And because of that search for legitimacy, it is being, at least for the time being, a bit more prudent, at least in the way they're talking about things and the way they're engaging with the West and the rest of the world, and engaging with the broader region as well. So I would love your concluding comments on where you see things going, particularly in terms of, is it sufficient leverage for the international community to have and the region to have that you have a government or a group that has emerged militarily victorious, trying to get international legitimacy? Is that the right path forward that perhaps will yield to some level of political inclusive settlement within Afghanistan? Because the dominant force right now, the Taliban, know that without international legitimacy, they can't do much with the rule that they have. So maybe start with Dr. Afiya, you, and then Hassan, and then conclude with Dr. Fahd.
Sure. So very quickly, because I'm not very confident about your question directly. I think for sure, if I were a member of the women's movement over there, I would certainly use that to negotiate and leverage the rights that I am demanding. I mean, that's just strategic, right? We can be politically whatever, and academically we can make all sorts of claims, but politically these things fragment on the ground. When you're faced with a post-conflict situation, you do all sorts of things. And I would have no problem with using that as leverage for negotiating rights for women. But I absolutely agree with what Hassan said. I mean, I think that's at least something that's in our control to some extent, right? That if we look specific, first of all, you can't split the political from the economic. So I think that, everybody's got to wrap their heads around that. That's what the political economy means. You can't split them and say, we only want to know an economic solution, but forget the politics. So my recommendation would be very specific. If you're really interested and want to invest in a sort of forming a second defense or a line of defense for Pakistan, focus on Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, focus on the newly merged districts, and consider this. There's only 6% or it's single digits where women's literacy rates, women in the labor force participation, minority rights are reneging every single day over there. You have women don't own bank accounts, they don't vote over there. What I'm saying is we have a model right here in Pakistan which we can use to throw all sorts of improvements, invest in. Why do we not have an IBA in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in these? Why do we not have a LUMS, or in Khyber? Why do we not invest in these sectors and suddenly expect them to show great resistance and sacrifice their lives and get trapped all over again between imperial forces and the Taliban over there? And then we wonder, where is this resurgence coming from? Why are we not paying attention to this part of Pakistan, which is a primary sort of space and territory and ripe sector for this kind of investment? So if you want to fix it, the only issue is that, if you always consider issues as what are the returns we're going to get, then you have to rethink what you mean by returns and what you mean by investment. That needs to be redefined as well. So my recommendation is, you want a strong resisting movement, authentic resistance from Pakistan, and you want it to withhold from these forces coming across, and you want to be strong enough to host refugees and do the morally correct thing, then strengthen these tribal districts, pay attention to the movements over there, and invest over there. To me, it's quite simple.
Thank you, Dr. Afiya. Hassan?
So I think what you said initially, no one can disagree with that, right? They need legitimacy, and I think it's obligation on the world to kind of negotiate better human rights, better women rights. So no disagreement there. I think we'd be better off, and when I say we, not just Pakistan, the world, if we take off the spectacles or the lens of the history So I think my suggestion would be not to judge Taliban by what we knew them by in 1990s. Also, do not wear glasses of excessive optimism. I think what Dr. Afia said in the beginning, look for some indicators which could give you early warnings or which could give you some early insights into how things are panning out on the ground. But approach the Taliban with absolute objectivity and see how they behave, number one. Secondly, when we go and negotiate with them, we as the world have realistic expectations. They are not going to have the Western form of democracy. Pakistan does not have a Western form of democracy, right? Yes, they should protect women's rights, but I think a comparator should be the gender situation in the 20 years of the US presence there, right? So that's a benchmark. You cannot compare them with Switzerland or Europe or even for that matter with Pakistan. I also think that in terms of other human rights issues, you need to give them some leverage and see, okay, how things were there and how they are panning out. And then see. And I think if you give them a realistic platform, realistic targets to negotiate on, probably there are more chances to get them to agree to that. So legitimize them if they give you that option, do legitimize them, do give them option, don't make it excessively hard for them. Otherwise, we will risk alienating them again. And in a few years down the road, it could again snowball into another global crisis. And I think that's what we all need to avoid. Thank you.
Thank you, Hassan. Dr. Fahd? You're on mute again.
Yeah. No, I think I sympathize with what Dr. Afiya and Hasaan Khawar has said. I think I agree with it in principle as well. I do see a lot of chances of many of those things happening, because I think even things like and to be I don't see this in any sort of critical way or in a manner of criticizing what they have said. I mean, none of their suggestions are, per se radical, but even having those implemented in Pakistan requires a reorientation of Pakistan's politics that I do not see happening anytime soon. I mean, the current balance of power with our specific history, the forces that hold the balance of power will actually continue to sort of, continue to act at the way that they have historically, the way they have historically done so far. With some sort of marginal changes. I think again the question of Taliban seeking legitimacy is not really about sort of them seeking legitimacy from us. It's basically them seeking legitimacy from the rest of the world. And essentially it's just like sort of you're talking about a bunch of Western European countries, US and China and Japan perhaps, right? So when would they be able to give them that kind of the legitimacy that they desire is if when they see them doing things that they would want them to do. And I think sort of having and making them do that would be the real challenge. I think we tend to reify Taliban. So Taliban don't come to existence as not just come to existence the way they exist on the ground, but they also have come to in a certain kind of existence in the manner we talk about them. So we reify them in the manner we talk about them, and the manner we talk about them is as if they are a very kind of unified force with a central command structure. They are a sort of bunch of 75-80,000 militant group which has sort of very kind of layers of authority, where the central leadership in Taliban may have actually cut deals with a lot of other groups in Afghanistan, in whether they come from the southern region or the eastern region, to cut deals to bring them on board in their resistance against the US. Now, once the US has gone, to what extent they would actually be able to control these other groups within their own ranks remains to be seen. So I think what Hassan said initially, and sort of not just initially, but repeatedly has made one extremely good point, is that it remains to be seen how Taliban behave. And I think the way they are going to behave is about the kind of internal, the kind of control that they have on their own internal dynamics. That is going to be extremely important about sort of about how Taliban is going to behave in the next sort of weeks and months. And I think for all of that, we'll just have to wait and see. There is no other way sort of to go about it. We'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely on point, and we do have to wait and see. And I think we have to look out for early warning indicators, some of which are already there for us to see. And from a government state level perspective, from a national strategic perspective, when you are in sort of this wait and see option mode, then the right path forward for a state is to keep a lot of options open and maintain some level of fluidity in the positions it takes and see where things go. And so far, I think overall Pakistan has done that. There are a lot of potential hazards and headwinds along the road. Some internally, some will have repercussions of what happens in Afghanistan and in Kabul. So we'll have to keep an eye out on all of that and then hope that the state navigates it. But in particular, I love Dr. Afiya's point that we need to make investments sort of on the not on the literal front lines, but the geographic front lines of where this ideological spillover may occur or may begin, which is the border on the KPK side. And if we can create sort of what Hassan you often call islands of success on the ground there, then that can be not only the early warning indicators, but also the bulwark that Pakistan needs to sustain if things go south and if there is a spillover indeed. So I think that is perhaps a really good, excellent recommendation in terms of what we should be looking at, because those early warnings and those early grassroots levels of communication and connectivity with the people over there will actually allow the state to have an early sense of what's going on and then react and build a strategy moving forward. So again, thank you so much to all of you for taking out the time and joining us today. This was fantastic. I know it's a Sunday, so doubly appreciate all of you taking out the time. And to the Park Launch team for organizing this. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Uzair, for doing this. Thank you.